That is a very narrow rejection of just one recommendation. There are multiple recommendations in this report that propose codes of conduct, regulations, and fines for other types of media content and other types of platform. Now, can the Prime Minister expand beyond this narrow rejection of just the question of licensing? This goes beyond that to other forms of codes of conduct, other aspects of this report that would restrict free speech. Will the Minister reject all the recommendations?
The Honourable Minister.
I said it in French. I will say it in English, Mr. Speaker. Our government believes in a strong, free, and independent press. The report we received from an independent panel specifically exempted news media from licensing requirements, and our government has said very clearly that we will not impose licensing requirements on news organization, nor will we regulate news content. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the fact that he can't go beyond that one narrow rejection and talk about the other forms of restrictions on free speech is very telling. We're not just talking about the independence of the press, we're talking about every single Canadian's right to have free speech online. This report is also proposing codes of conduct and letting government determine, quote, trusted content. Now, when the Minister of Heritage can't even be trusted to get his answers straight, why would Canadians want him to tell them which sites can be trusted?
The Honourable Minister of Heritage.
Mr. Speaker, we welcome the recommendations from this independent panel, and I will be happy to sit with members of the opposition to look at the bill that we will put on the table in the very near future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Now, Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister said something in this House that simply was not true. He said that in the TMX case, the courts had ruled that free, prior, and informed consent did not constitute a veto. They did no such thing. The court ruled that the duty to consult did not grant a veto. Now, a United Nations declaration that this government is planning on proposing will, in fact, require free, prior, and informed consent and will give one group that does not want to proceed with a project an effective veto. So, will the Liberals abandon their plans to implement this UN resolution?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I was honoured to receive in my mandate letter from the Prime Minister the task of implementing UNDRIP into our Canadian law. One of our priorities, therefore, is to introduce co-developed legislation to implement UNDRIP by the end of 2020. Mr. Speaker, we will be engaging with Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and working in partnership, in particular with Indigenous peoples, to make the declaration a reality in Canada as a framework for reconciliation.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the court ruling was very clear. The dozens and dozens of First Nations community who supported this project have a right to see it proceed. And it is this government's plan to implement a United Nations resolution that would require free, prior, and informed consent from every single group. So can the minister explain what happens if one of those communities withholds their consent?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, implementing UNDRIP is a priority for this government. Free, prior, and informed consent is, Mr. Speaker, one of the key provisions of that. I would ask, Mr. Speaker, that the Leader of the Opposition look at what's happened with Bill 41 in British Columbia with an implementation of UNDRIP, and in which free, prior, and informed consent is not considered to be a veto.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, during the election, the Prime Minister said that he wouldn't challenge Bill 21 for the moment, but the time has come apparently to challenge the bill, and this time using Quebec taxpayer money. This morning, François Legault said that the Prime Minister is insulting Quebecers. He said, "This is not without consequence. This is a challenge to a law that was passed with the support of the nation of Quebec." My question is simple. Does the government recognize that it should not be challenging Bill 21 with Quebec taxpayers' money, especially when it goes against the desires of Quebecers? The Honourable Minister of Heritage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would remind my colleague that the court challenges program is a fully independent and non-political program. We have no role to play in the allocation of funds or the way criteria for the program are defined. Those decisions are made by an independent committee of experts who ensure that the program is administered in an impartial, independent way. I think that my colleagues should understand that concept of independence well. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, Tuesday, in response to the block, the Minister of Justice said that it would be okay to challenge Bill 21. He said there are Quebecers who are currently challenging the bill before the courts, and that's the right thing to do. The next day, we learned that the English Montreal School Board would be challenging Bill 21 with Ottawa money. That's our money. So will the minister be transparent and finally say whether yes or no he supports a challenge of Bill 21, regardless of where it comes from? The Honourable Government House Leader. As has been said a number of times, Bill 21 is a bill that was tabled by the Government of Quebec in the National Assembly. It was debated by Quebecers, and it's now in force in Quebec. It is being challenged by other Quebecers. So we're just monitoring the situation, Mr. Speaker. That's all we're doing. The Honourable Member for Burnaby South. Mr. Speaker, once again, nearly 50 workers have lost their jobs. And more than that, they've lost their benefits because this government is refusing to change the bankruptcy law.
Furniture has filed for bankruptcy, which means nearly 50 workers are going to lose their jobs, and that means they're also going to lose their benefits. For some workers, that means losing as much as $50,000. When will this Liberal government stop prioritizing bankers and financiers and instead change the bankruptcy laws to protect working families, working people and their families?
Hear, hear. The Honourable okay. The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, as the member opposite has raised, we know that individuals are going through some difficult times, particularly individuals that are subjected to the bankruptcy law. That is why in Budget 2019, we took important steps to make insolvency proceedings fair and more transparent, like ensuring better oversight over corporate behavior. We understand that protecting Canadian and Canadian workers is a priority, and we'll continue to do that, Mr. Speaker.
For Burnaby South.
Monsieur le Président, nous avons
Mr. Speaker, we asked the Liberal government how much they spent to take First Nations children to court. They said $5 million. But when Cindy Blackstock asked the same question, they said over $8 million.
How much is this government spending on taking First Nations kids to court? Is it over $5 million that they told us, or is it over $8 million that they told Cindy Blackstock? My question is simple. How much money is this Liberal government spending taking First Nations kids to court?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, we fully agree that we must compensate First Nations children harmed by past government policies. The Department of Justice, Mr. Speaker, has a consistent formula that officials use to calculate legal costs in all these matters. As we have said previously, Mr. Speaker, our focus remains on finding a fair and equitable solution for First Nations children who have been negatively impacted by child and family policies. That remains the same.
Honourable Member for Richmond-Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, we've learned that 2 Canadians contracted coronavirus on a Japanese cruise ship with 3,700 passengers on board, including 251 Canadians. 2 of those Canadians are Diane and Bernard Ménard, a couple from Gatineau who are currently confined to their cabin. The problem is that Ms. Bernard's health could deteriorate because she no longer has her diabetes medication. Can the Prime Minister tell us if he has a plan to help these Canadians who were caught in a very risky situation on this ship? The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague for his important question. This is obviously a situation that we're monitoring very closely. As you know, the health and safety of Canadians abroad is a priority for us. We know that we have 255 Canadians on that boat, and consular officials are currently in contact with each one of those individuals to provide any consular assistance necessary. We will always be there for Canadians abroad.